At 1647 on October 12, 1943, on the eastern edge of the village of Novoselivka in central Ukraine, a single M4A2 Sherman stood half-submerged in brown autumn mud. Smoke from burning haystacks drifted across the low ground. German shells were falling at irregular intervals, each impact sending ripples through puddles around the tank's hull. Inside the Sherman, a Red Army mechanic named Senior Sergeant Mikhail Anisimov was kneeling on the engine deck, one hand gripping a dented hand-operated fuel pump taken from a Studebaker truck, the other braced against the shaking hull. Each time he worked the lever, diesel fuel surged through a rubber hose into the engine's intake system. Each time he stopped, the engine coughed, lost revolutions, and threatened to die. A Panzer IV Ausf had just appeared at the far end of the village street, 480 meters away, its long gun lowering toward the stalled Sherman. The Soviet gunner shouted that he needed 10 more seconds to traverse through the mud. The driver yelled that the engine was dying. Anisimov pumped faster, sweat cutting paths through dried mud on his face. A German shell slammed into a barn behind them. Splinters of wood rattled across the Sherman's armor. The engine surged again, barely alive. If Anisimov's arm failed, the tank would stop. If the tank stopped, the Panzer IV would fire. German soldiers were already watching in disbelief, trying to understand why a Sherman that should have been dead was still moving at all. How did a tank with no fuel pump reach this moment? 2 days earlier, on October 10, 1943, the 3rd Guards Tank Corps was pushing west through the flat agricultural lands east of the Dnieper River. The Red Army was expanding its bridgeheads, exploiting German retreat after the summer disasters at Kursk and Kharkov. The terrain around Novoselivka was low, open, and ruined by autumn rains. Fields had turned into thick black mud. Dirt roads were barely passable. Villages were clusters of wooden houses built along shallow rises, the only dry ground for kilometers. The mission of the 3rd Guards Tank Corps that week was simple and brutal: push forward fast enough that German rear guards could not form stable defensive lines. Every hour mattered. A stalled tank could block a road and halt an entire column. A broken vehicle could doom an attack before it began. The Sherman in question belonged to the 2nd Battalion of the 9th Guards Tank Brigade. It was an American-built M4A2 diesel variant delivered under Lend-Lease, favored by Soviet crews for its reliable engine and thick armor. Its crew had named it Tucha, Storm Cloud, after the dark paint they had brushed over its turret with captured German pigment. Their mission on October 12 was to break into Novoselivka ahead of the main column, clear German panzergrenadiers from the village, and hold the road junction until more tanks arrived. If they failed, German forces could counterattack the supply road feeding the entire corps. What no one expected was that Tucha would reach the battlefield already wounded. Senior Sergeant Mikhail Anisimov was not officially part of the tank crew. He was a field mechanic assigned to the brigade's mobile repair platoon, trained to keep tanks alive long enough to finish their missions. Before the war, he had repaired river boats on the Volga, learning to keep engines running with whatever tools and parts were at hand. He trusted machines, but he feared sudden failures, because sudden failures killed men. He rode on Tucha that week because its engine had shown early signs of fuel system trouble. 2 days before, he had noticed uneven fuel pressure during a road test. The Sherman's twin-diesel engine required steady fuel delivery. If pressure dropped, power collapsed instantly. Anisimov suspected wear in the internal fuel pump, but there was no time or spare parts for a full replacement. He told the crew he would ride with them and watch the system under combat conditions. The tank commander, Lieutenant Sergei Morozov, did not like carrying a mechanic into battle. But he liked the idea of losing his engine in mud even less. He agreed. By morning on October 12, rain had fallen all night. The ground around Novoselivka was a swamp. German panzer grenadiers were reported inside the village with at least one Panzer IV covering the main road. Soviet infantry lagged behind, slowed by mud and broken carts. Tucha and 2 other Shermans were ordered to advance alone, clear the first street, and signal for reinforcements. They reached the village outskirts at 15:58. Small arms fire rattled against the hull. The Shermans answered with high explosive shells, smashing through wooden houses used as firing positions. Tucha turned left onto the main road, tracks grinding through mud mixed with broken bricks. Then, without warning, the engine lost power. Not slowly. Not gradually. One moment it roared at medium revolutions. The next it dropped to a weak, coughing idle. The driver, Corporal Yefimov, shouted that the engine was starving. The tank slowed in the middle of the road. Anisimov opened the engine access hatch and felt the fuel lines. They were dry. The pressure gauge showed nothing. The internal fuel pump had failed completely, not frozen, not clogged, but mechanically dead. The engine was still intact. The fuel in the tanks was full. But without the pump, the engine could not pull fuel on its own. In combat, this meant the tank was already a wreck. German fire intensified immediately. The enemy saw the slowdown. Machine guns began firing from upper windows. A Panzerfaust exploded against the road behind them, missing the hull by meters. Morozov ordered smoke fired and tried to reverse, but the engine had no power. They were stranded in the middle of a village street with German infantry closing in. Anisimov understood instantly what this meant. If he could not move fuel into the engine by some other method, they would all die in that street. There was no spare fuel pump. No time to tow. No way to replace the system. He remembered the hand-operated fuel transfer pumps used on Studebaker trucks, simple lever devices meant to move diesel between barrels. One was strapped to the rear of Tucha for refueling in the field. He ripped it loose, tore off a section of rubber hose, and began forcing fuel directly toward the engine's intake line. The first strokes did nothing. Then the engine coughed. German bullets began striking the turret. Splinters flew inside through open hatches. The gunners screamed that infantry were moving through side alleys. Anisimov pumped harder. The engine surged again, weak but alive. Morozov shouted to move. The driver engaged the clutch. The tank crawled forward, slowly, unevenly, but moving. Every meter forward depended on Anisimov's arm. Every second, German soldiers watched in confusion as a tank that should have been dead dragged itself through the mud, driven not by machinery alone, but by a man forcing fuel into its heart by hand. And as the street narrowed and the Panzer IV began to roll into view ahead, Anisimov realized something terrible. If the German tank opened fire before his arm failed, they might live. If his arm failed first, they would die exactly where the world expected them to, inside a tank with no fuel pump, alone in a ruined Ukrainian village. The engine surged and sagged in uneven waves as Tucha crawled deeper into Novoselivka. Each pull of Anisimov's arm forced a brief pulse of life into the diesel. Each pause brought the engine closer to silence. The hand pump's lever was slick with fuel and sweat. His shoulder burned. His wrist had begun to shake. German rifle fire intensified. Bullets slapped against the hull and turret, sharp metallic cracks echoing inside the fighting compartment. The loader was bleeding from a splinter that had torn into his cheek, but he kept feeding shells into the breach. The gunner fired at windows where muzzle flashes appeared, blowing holes through walls and roofs, yet the enemy kept moving. They advanced no faster than a man could walk. Sometimes slower. Morozov leaned from the turret hatch, scanning the street through binoculars. He saw the Panzer IV only for a moment, its dark shape rolling forward between two barns at the far end of the village, gun already pointed down the road. It stopped at a distance of about 500 meters, partially concealed behind a collapsed fence and a pile of logs. The German commander had time. He could aim carefully. Morozov shouted for smoke. The loader fired a smoke round, but the shell landed too far forward, leaving much of the street exposed. Wind pushed the smoke sideways, opening a clear corridor straight to the Sherman. Anisimov pumped faster. His muscles screamed. He could feel the lever biting into his palm. Diesel splashed across his sleeve. The engine began to misfire. The rhythm of pumping could no longer keep pressure steady. The driver shouted that the tank was losing torque. The tracks were slipping in the mud. They were no longer advancing. A German shell flew past and struck a house behind them, collapsing the roof. Dust filled the air. Morozov realized they would not reach cover before the Panzer IV fired. He ordered the gunner to take the shot. The gunner tried, but the turret was half sunk in mud on one side. Traversing was slow. He lined up as best he could and fired. The shell struck short, exploding in the mud between the tanks. The German Panzer IV did not fire immediately. It backed slightly, adjusting position for a cleaner shot. Anisimov felt his strength fading. He had been pumping for nearly 8 minutes without rest. His arm trembled uncontrollably. He knew what would happen next. The engine would die. The tank would stop. The Germans would fire. He made a decision that terrified him more than bullets. He tied the hand pump's lever to a short length of rope, looped the rope around his shoulder, and braced himself against the engine housing. Instead of pumping with his arm, he began rocking his entire body forward and back, using his weight to drive the lever. It was clumsy. Pain shot through his ribs each time the rope jerked tight. But it worked. Fuel surged again. The engine caught. The driver pushed forward with everything the engine could give. The tracks bit into a slightly drier patch of ground near a destroyed cart. The tank moved another 10 meters. German infantry were now less than 50 meters away on both sides. One Panzerfaust exploded against the road just behind them, throwing mud across the engine deck. Morozov ordered machine gun fire down the alleys. The hull gunner swept the sides, cutting down 2 figures running with launchers. Others kept coming. The Panzer IV fired. The shell screamed past Tucha's turret and slammed into a stone wall just behind them, shattering it. Chunks of masonry rained onto the Sherman's rear armor. The German tank had misjudged the slow, uneven movement. It corrected its aim. Anisimov could barely breathe. His chest ached from slamming into the engine housing again and again. His legs were slipping in diesel and mud. If he fell, the rope would slacken. The engine would die instantly. He shouted to Morozov that he could not keep this up much longer. Morozov saw a narrow side road leading left between 2 barns. If they could reach it, the buildings would block the Panzer IV's line of fire. But the turn required power. Real power. More than the dying engine wanted to give. Morozov told Anisimov he needed everything he had left. Anisimov nodded. He untied the rope from his shoulder and wrapped it around both arms, locking the lever tight against his chest. Then he began throwing his whole body into it, using his legs to drive forward and slam back, over and over. Each movement was agony. His vision blurred. His breath came in short gasps. But the engine responded. It surged harder than it had since the pump died. The driver saw the revolutions climb and turn sharply left. The tracks fought the mud. The tank slid sideways, almost stopping, then lurched forward into the side road. At that moment, the Panzer IV fired again. The shell struck the road where Tucha had been seconds earlier, blasting a crater big enough to swallow a man. Mud and debris covered the rear of the Sherman. Inside, everyone went silent for a heartbeat. They were still alive. The buildings now blocked the German tank's gun. The street behind them was invisible to the Panzer IV. German infantry were still nearby, but without tank support they hesitated, unsure whether to press forward into the narrow lane under heavy machine gun fire. Tucha rolled another 30 meters before the engine finally failed. Anisimov collapsed against the engine deck. His arms would not move. The tank stopped between 2 barns, hidden from the main road. Smoke drifted from damaged buildings nearby. German voices could be heard shouting in the distance, but no one was close enough to attack immediately. Morozov ordered silence. They waited, listening. Anisimov lay on his back, staring at the metal ceiling, chest heaving. He knew he could not pump anymore. If the Germans attacked now, the tank could not move again. Minutes passed. Then Soviet infantry finally arrived from the rear, pushing into the village. Gunfire shifted away from Tuchaw's position as Red Army soldiers engaged the Panzer Grenadiers. The Panzer IV withdrew to avoid being flanked. By nightfall, Novoselivka was in Soviet hands. Tuchaw never moved again that day. When the repair platoon reached the tank, they confirmed what Anisimov already knew. The internal fuel pump had shattered. There was no quick repair. But the engine itself was undamaged. In their report, the officers wrote that the tank had continued fighting by manual fuel supply under combat conditions, a phrase that no one outside the brigade truly understood. Anisimov was taken to a medical tent with torn muscles and cracked ribs. He survived. The crew survived. And the German soldiers who had watched a dead tank crawl through fire would never forget the sight of a Sherman that refused to stop, even when its heart had already failed. They towed Tuchaw out of Novoselivka at dawn on October 13, 1943. The mud had hardened slightly overnight as temperatures dropped close to freezing. Steam rose from the ground where tracks and boots had churned the earth into pulp the day before. The village no longer burned, but it smelled of smoke, wet wood, and diesel. Anisimov watched from a stretcher as the tank was dragged past him. He could not lift his arms. Both shoulders were swollen, dark with bruises. His ribs were bound tightly. A medic told him he would not work for weeks. Anisimov did not answer. He stared only at the Sherman's rear deck, where the hand pump still lay, stained with fuel and blood. Morozov came to him before returning to his crew. He said little. He only removed his cap, nodded once, and placed it briefly on Anisimov's chest. Among tankers, this was not ceremony. It was acknowledgement. The brigade repair report listed the failure in formal language. Vehicle M4A2, turret number 213. Cause of immobilization, internal fuel pump destruction, mechanical fracture. Under combat conditions, mechanic forced fuel into engine manually using auxiliary transfer pump, allowing limited movement for tactical withdrawal. No further explanation was offered. No diagram was drawn. No regulation existed for such a procedure. In the days that followed, rumors spread through the corps. Some said the mechanic had used gravity feed. Others said he had siphoned fuel with his mouth. A few claimed the tank had moved on fumes alone, driven by desperation rather than diesel. Those who had been inside Tuchaw told the truth quietly, and only to other tank men. Anisimov was sent to the rear for recovery. In a field hospital near Kremenchuk, he dictated a short statement to a clerk because his hands still shook too badly to write. "I did not invent anything," he said. "I only moved fuel because fuel must move or men die." The clerk wrote it down exactly as spoken. Morozov's crew received a replacement tank within 3 days. They named it Tuchadva, but they never painted it as dark as the first. When asked why, Morozov said the color had already done its work once. On October 18, the 3rd Guards Tank Corps moved again, crossing deeper into Ukraine. Tuchaw remained behind, stripped for parts. Its engine was eventually repaired with a new pump taken from another disabled Sherman. By then, the tank was no longer needed at the front. It served as a training vehicle near a depot for the rest of the year. But the story followed the men. In November, a political officer tried to write an article about heroic field engineering. He wanted to describe Anisimov as a model Soviet innovator, inventing a new method of fuel delivery under fire. The tankers objected. Morozov told him plainly that no one should ever try it on purpose. It was not a method. It was survival. The article was never published. In the winter of 1943-44, during a pause in operations near the Polish border, a young officer in the Corps began collecting stories from tank crews. He kept a small notebook and wrote at night by candlelight. One entry read, "They say a Sherman once moved without a pump. I asked how. They say a man became the pump. I cannot imagine this, but too many speak of it for it to be nothing." No names were written. After the war, Anisimov returned to civilian life. He went back to repairing engines on river boats, then later trucks. He spoke little of the war. When asked, he said only that machines were honest and battle was not. He died in the late 1960s. His family found no medals beyond the ordinary ones given to millions of soldiers. There was no special citation for turning one's body into a part of a machine. The brigade archives were partially destroyed during later movements. Some reports survived. Others did not. The line about manual fuel supply under combat conditions remained, but without names, sketches, or explanation. In the 1970s, a military historian reviewing Lend-Lease tank performance found the line and marked it with a question. In his margin notes he wrote, "Possibly exaggerated. Human-powered fuel delivery at required pressure seems unlikely for more than seconds." Another historian disagreed years later, pointing out that the M4A2 diesel could run at low revolutions with minimal pressure if fuel was forced directly into the intake line. He wrote, "Mechanically improbable, but not impossible under emergency conditions." Neither could prove it. Veterans of the 9th Guards Tank Brigade told the story differently each time. Some said Anisimov pumped for 3 minutes. Some said 10. One claimed it lasted nearly 20. Distances changed. Enemy numbers grew or shrank. Only one detail never changed. The tank had no fuel pump. And it moved anyway. Among German veterans, a strange memory also existed. In letters written after the war, one former Panzergrenadier described a Soviet tank that would not die. "We saw it slow, then crawl, then almost stop," he wrote. "We thought it was finished. But it kept moving like a wounded animal. Our tank fired and missed because it moved when it should not have moved. I still do not understand this." He never learned. No manual ever included such a procedure. No training school taught it. No regulation recommended it. It was not doctrine. It was not engineering. It was a man refusing to accept that a broken machine meant certain death. Historians still argue whether the event happened exactly as told. Some say it was embellished. Some say it was misunderstood. Some say it was impossible. But in October 1943, in a muddy Ukrainian village called Novoselivka, German soldiers watched a Sherman with no fuel pump move when it had no right to move. And several Soviet tankers lived because of it. To those who listen, remember that history is not only written by generals and maps, but also by hands shaking with pain, forcing broken machines to carry living men one moment longer than they were ever meant to.